and here I am 3 million in the hole, and I have nothing. I realized that I was looking through the world through the wrong lens. And while I was always a good doctor and cared about people, it was all about me versus saying, how can I be of service? And that changed everything. The experiences we've had, even the painful ones, are not something we should hide because they make us who we are. They give us resilience. They give us strength.
Dr. James R. Doty is a Stanford neurosurgeon, New York Times bestselling author, and he's revealing that manifestation is rooted in science. His teachings provide us practices for neurological transformation by strategically targeting your attention, your desires, your obstacles, intention, passion, and expectations so that you can consciously create the life that you want. Can you share, how did you get initiated into this knowledge about manifestation and about being able to essentially be a creator in your life when you started off in a very difficult situation? Can you share your story?
Sure. And from my first book, as you know, Into the Magic Shop, I talk about this, but I grew up in poverty. My father was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke when I was a child. She was partially paralyzed. She had a seizure disorder, unfortunately chronically depressed, attempted suicide multiple times. We were on public assistance, evicted from different places. And of course, this is not the ideal environment to succeed in society. And it's really sad too, because if you're reasonably intelligent, you sit there and you go, what's wrong? Why don't I have access to that? Now, if you're not that intelligent, you sit there and go, well, I accept this. This is the situation here, and it's okay. And you don't think about other possibilities for yourself. But for me, I couldn't understand. I said, well, I seem to be as smart as these other people. I work hard. And first of all, it made me realize that it doesn't matter oftentimes how good you are, how smart you are, if you're in these environments. And as you know from the first sentence in the new book, Mind Magic, can you say profanity on it?
Yes, absolutely.
I write this sentence that says, the universe doesn't give a about you. And I don't mean that in a negative way. What I mean by that is that the universe isn't looking at you. It doesn't care about you. Things, frankly, often happen by accident. As an example, you look at some people, and some people use the term, they won the sperm lottery, right? They grew up with wealth or position or access to resources that you may not have. And it's not because they're bad. It's not because they're good. It just, that happens sometimes. So for me, though, because of my family situation, frankly, when there were issues, I would get on my bicycle and ride as far and as fast away as I could. And on one of those excursions, I ended up at a strip mall. And in the strip mall was a magic shop. And I'd had an interest in magic. I used to have this plastic thumb that I would use for tricks. And I walked into this magic shop, and there was a lady there. And she was in her 50s, but she's one of these people who had this radiant personality, a smile that just embraced you. You felt okay. Yeah. And it turned out she was the owner's mother. And frankly, she knew nothing about magic. She just happened to be minding the store because her son was off doing an errand. But we began talking. And the thing about her, and this is something I think we all want, is to have an environment of psychological safety. Where you feel you're not being judged, people are authentically interested in you, and they treat you like an equal. They don't look down on you. And this was how she was. And so we began a conversation, and she asked me some questions that normally I wouldn't answer because, you know, if you're poor, you're ashamed. And in this case, though, I did answer them. And after speaking for 20 or 30 minutes, she said to me, you know, I'm here for another 6 weeks. If you come every day, I think I could teach you something that could really help you. Now, of course, I'm not going to tell you that I had any degree of self-awareness or insight. I did not at all. I was a 12-year-old poor kid. But The reality was, though, frankly, I had nothing better to do. She was very nice, and she was giving me chocolate chip cookies and promising something that I didn't understand, but I thought, why not? And so I showed up every day for 6 weeks. And it was amazing because I didn't realize, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate, it's one thing to talk about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder associated with soldiers. But the reality is children who grow up in chaotic, dysfunctional environments, that is a form of constant trauma. And many of these children grow up with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're not able to integrate into society. Their sympathetic nervous system is chronically activated. Yeah. They're always looking around. They can't focus. They're tense. And certainly that was my situation. And so when I met with Ruth, you have to remember this was before mindfulness, meditation were common words at all. So when I started meeting with her, I mean, to be frank with you, I sort of thought she was full of shit. I mean, because, I mean, you know, you're a 12-year-old kid. You've never been in this place where you're asked to relax your muscles or concentrate. But that being said, I showed up and I did it. And I suddenly began experiencing that I was more relaxed. She taught me a technique of focus, because the reality is to accomplish, to learn, you have to be present. And if you're thinking about the past all the time of what could have been, should have been, might have been, or looking at a future that hasn't occurred yet, you're not present. So once I learned how to be present, the next thing she taught me was that the narrative that I had going on in my head was not truth. And what I mean by that is, unfortunately, so many of us tell ourselves we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, we're not worthy, we don't deserve love. And when you tell yourself that, that becomes truth. It's just like if you say the word I can't, that becomes truth. Yeah. And what people don't understand is, as a result of this, based on actually the power we have within our brains, that becomes truth, and that results in limited beliefs. And the thing, though, is that it is within our power to liberate ourselves. Every time you say a negative comment, it's like putting a brick down in a wall in a prison that you're creating for yourself, and the walls get higher and it gets darker. Yet within your pocket is the key to open the door. It's the question is when you're going to realize that the key was always there and you didn't have to build that wall. And that is fundamentally how we liberate ourselves and how we take control of our lives and understand our own self-agency to change our lives. It's not from the universe. And then once we understand this, this gives us incredible power to improve ourselves. But the other thing is that once you stop being hypercritical with yourself, it changes how you see the world. Because if you're constantly hypercritical, then you look at the world through the lens of being hypercritical of others and being judgmental. And as a result, it also limits your connection to people. And what I tell people is when I stopped criticizing myself and how I looked at the world changed how it looked at me. Because if you're constantly angry, if you're constantly upset, if you're constantly thinking the world is unfair, you give off this vibe to everyone around you. And sometimes it scares people. And also it allowed me to forgive my parents in the sense that it wasn't an issue that they didn't love me. It was an issue that they had their own pain and they did not have the resources to help themselves.
Yeah. There's two things that I want you to share. So number one, you just shared how our beliefs are going to essentially, it's going to change the way that we're seeing the world and also how the world sees us. And you mentioned emitting a vibe, but that's not again, it's just not something that's kind of superficial or hearsay. Like there's a literal kind of emanation or a field that that emanates from the human heart, for example.
No, that's absolutely correct. And this is why if you sometimes you look at somebody who is just standing there and you have an immediate feeling about the energy they're giving off. And what people don't appreciate is whether it's the brain or the heart, we emanate energy. Some people call it vibration. Some people call it oscillation. But that's true. As an example, the heart itself emanates energy that's measurable about 3 to 5 feet away from you. And there are, in fact, a number of conditions where your emotional state actually affects your physiology and this vibrational energy. So that's all really true. And this is why there are people you can walk up to and you immediately feel goodness and that they're there for you, they're listening, they're present. They don't have to say anything. It's just how they carry themselves. And then there are other people who you cross the street if you see them. Now, I would temper that with the statement that there are implicit unconscious biases that are not truth and that are affected by the fact that our brain is a predictor of behavior and it looks for patterns, and whether the pattern is correct or not, it still results in interpretation.
Yeah.
And this can result in unfair biases or unfair judgments. So you have to be aware of that and sit there and analyze yourself. Is this truth or not truth? And is it possible that the judgment I just made is not correct? And certainly, this is something I've learned on more than one occasion.
Yeah. A good example would be, you're around somebody that is uniquely good and helpful and somebody who, aspires to be of service and all those things, but you can feel uncomfortable around them because we might have a blueprint that is threatened by that. It's threatening our safety because we don't want to change. We don't want to be altruistic or to, challenge ourselves to do more. And so we might feel uncomfortable around somebody that might challenge us to be better, And yeah, so it's like, it's a both and thing, it's the environment around us and the people, their unique energy and also ours and how things resonate essentially.
Well, and that's really a good point. I mean, you have to appreciate that, again, we don't have insight oftentimes, which causes us to be afraid. What are the causes? Could it be somebody's stature? Could it potentially be a sense, true or not, that they're somehow more educated or smarter or more accomplished? Or you're afraid that you're going to be judged by them and you're not going to pass. Yeah. And this is, again, with mind training and understanding how your brain works, you get a sense of who you are. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this concept of wabi-sabi and kintsugi. Mm-hmm. But the point is that many people are afraid of showing their vulnerability. Because they feel that somebody's going to use it against them. Yet, if you look at the principles of kintsugi, which date back to the 15th century Japan, and how they repaired pottery, it used to be that they tried to hide the cracks in the pottery when they repaired it. But ultimately, they understood that the experiences we've had, even the painful ones, are not something we should hide because they make us who we are. They give us resilience. They give us strength. So they started repairing the pottery with golden glue. So when you held the piece, it was broken, but you honored that brokenness, that it was repaired. And I think that's a wonderful metaphor for loving yourself and accepting yourself, because there's not a human alive who has not made mistakes, who's not messed up, who has not been hurt. And that makes us unique and makes us who we are. And there's nothing to hide from. And unfortunately, in modern society, many people are terrified of judgment. And this is causing a huge amount of mental health issues in terms of stress, anxiety, depression, because people keep striving to live up to levels that are not fair for them. They shouldn't be required to do that. We should give people love, acceptance, and that is the greatest motivator and power to allow somebody to change their lives.
Yeah, and that's what she did for you. She helped you to establish those things and a sense of self-value, and from there gave you some direction on creating a life that you really wanted. And so did she ask you to actually write out what you wanted to accomplish?
Yeah, and in fact, I discuss some of these things in this new book, Mind Magic, which actually is a result of the first book. And the reason I say that is one of the other parts of what she taught me was I call the visualization technique, but in fact was a manifestation technique. Now you have to appreciate I was 12 at the time and poor and not self-aware. So when she asked me to write down things that I wanted, I did it, frankly, from a perspective that many people would. I thought that, well, I want to be a doctor. And it wasn't so much I didn't want to help people, but I was a doctor and people would see me as important and accomplished. Or I wanted a mansion, or I wanted a Porsche. I remember walking along one day and seeing a guy in a silver Targa, and I said, I want that. And I did get it, but and I wanted a Rolex, and I wanted $1 million, which seemed like a lot of money in 1968. But I did this practice of visualization, but what strengthens that or does something which we call value tagging is through intention and repetition and utilizing as many sensory organs because that's the information that comes in. So it's thinking about it, it's writing it down, it's seeing yourself writing it down, it's using your hand to write it down, reading it silently, reading it aloud, visualizing you being in that position. And literally, I did this hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of times, and created this image of who I wanted to be. The problem with it was that I got every one of those things, but my motivation was out of a fear narrative. It wasn't out of a love narrative. And what I mean by that was I thought that if I just had those things, they would make me whole. I would be okay. And everyone would see I was okay. Yeah. But it didn't do that. It made me actually more and more unhappy because here I had all of these friends saying, man, you've done it, dude. You have everything. You know, I remember there was a restaurant where I lived in Newport Beach, and it actually was owned by Kevin Costner's wife at the time. It was called Twin Palms, and it was this amazing restaurant in this mall in Newport Beach. And I would drive my yellow Ferrari there, and I would park in front. I knew the owner, and, you know, I would jump out of my car, and I had a tailor who made all of my clothes, and I had a table there, and I would sit there at my table, and people would come up, and I would just chat with them, and invariably there were a number of women who would show up. And, you know, all my buddies were going, God, that's amazing, dude. Gosh, you're living the life. And yet I would go home, and sometimes with a woman I met, and I would wake up the next morning and I would have this horrible feeling that, what am I doing? I don't even care about this person yet. You know, I'm trying to live up to an image, but it's not me and it's not making me happy. Yeah. And it wasn't until I lost almost $80 million in 6 weeks and was $3 million in the hole that I sort of went back and reflected on where I was. And one of the things I realized was that I had not really honored Ruth, but I was 12. And when I went through everything and all of our conversations, I realized that I was looking through the world through the wrong lens. And while I was always a good doctor and cared about people, it was all about me versus saying, how can I be of service? And that changed everything. And it resulted actually, which is an interesting thing. I had just started dating my present wife at the time. Here I am, $3 million in the hole, and I'm dealing with the banker who I borrow $15 million from, who I have to pay back. So I have to sell everything. And my lawyers, because I created all these complicated trusts because of my wealth. And one of the things that occurred was the lawyer, when I was dealing with, he said to me, Jim, we were supposed to create this irrevocable charitable trust, and we actually did not file the paperwork. So all of the stock you were going to give away, actually, you don't have to give it away. And I thought about this for a long time. And here I am, $3 million in the hole, and I have nothing. But at the end of the day, I told him to go ahead and give it away. Mm-hmm. So that ended up being about $30 million.
Oh, man.
But what did it do? In some ways, it liberated me also. Yeah. Because if you're poor, it's like a monkey on your back, right? You worry about it. How am I going to pay the bills? What am I going to do? What happens if X, Y, or Z happens? And so I went ahead and gave it away. But this allowed me to create health clinics around the world, programs for the disabled, programs for adolescents affected by AIDS, HIV. It allowed me to set up endowed chairs at different universities, set up scholarships, fund research at Stanford. And amazingly, it allowed me to meet the Dalai Lama, who became the founding benefactor at the center I created at Stanford, and who became a close friend. And I became chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation. This then allowed me to meet Desmond Tutu and Thich Nhat Hanh and a number of other spiritual and religious leaders, Eckhart Tolle, Amma the Hugging Saint, Sadhguru, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, and develop relationships with them. Now, I mentioned my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, but the Wall Street Journal did an article, and it said, well, what do you think about what he did? And she goes, I don't mind him being generous. I just wish he hadn't given it all away.
Keep a little bit.
Yes. But the other side of that coin, though, is that the first part was I truly did go from rags to riches. But when I lost everything again, my worst case scenario is I'm a neurosurgeon who gets paid more than 99.9% of people. So I was never going to starve. But I still say I went from rags to riches in the sense of a spiritual journey.
Yeah.
Being empty because I was chasing things that meant nothing, to leading a life of purpose and meaning. That's the real riches.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Wow. I mean, that journey in and of itself is remarkable. And, to be able to put all this together for us. And also the great thing about this book, and looking at some of the things from the previous book, this book is really more for us, right? The first book was a lot more about your story, and there were principles in there, but this one is like, this is how you do it. And also learning from my mistakes, that part that I missed out on, essentially, and I said this statement earlier, it's the come from. Where are you coming from with your intention and your ability to manifest? Because you're manifesting all the time, but where's your come from? And so I want to talk about this specifically because having you here and your experience and talking about the brain is really one of the greatest gifts we could get, which is, what are these parts of our brain? What are these aspects of our brain that we are using for all this stuff? Let's talk about some of the different networks in the brain that are involved and that we can affect to create what we want in our lives.
Sure. So the first thing is, and I talked about the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, but this vagus nerve, which has both of these nerves in it, and these nerves are distributed throughout the body and all of our major organ systems. And it's a two-way street, so you're getting information from them as well. But they fundamentally affect the brain itself. And I mentioned how I was able to manifest these things when I was 12 that led to, on some level, amazing success. But it was from a fear narrative. And when you're fearful, actually, oftentimes it limits many of what we call our cognitive brain networks from functioning at their best. But that doesn't mean you still can't accomplish or have those intentions manifest. The problem is that for many people, they don't appreciate the difference between the two, the I want versus how can I be of help. And so many people are able to accomplish, if you will, selfish needs, but it doesn't make them happy. And I'm sure you know a lot of very successful, at least by our societal narrative of happiness and success, money, power, and position, who frankly are not happy at all. And they keep striving to get more, but it's not making them any more happy because they're confused. They don't have that insight and self-awareness. And they're all focused on everybody looking at them and saying how great they are. So the reality, though, is when you look through a different lens, the lens of how can I be of service? How can I be helpful? And this is activation of your parasympathetic nervous system, because that is how we evolved as a species to live. Events that stimulate our sympathetic nervous system hundreds of years ago, or even thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, were typically short-lived events. Right. Your sympathetic nervous system responded to the threat. The threat went away, or you were eaten. But then you were back at your baseline. That's where we're meant to live. Yeah. Yet the nature of modern society is constantly activating our sympathetic nervous system. Mm-hmm. But if you get into that mental state of activating your parasympathetic nervous system, what happens is not only does your peripheral physiology work much better, but your brain works much better, these cognitive brain networks. Mm-hmm. So one, the process of manifesting, we talked about sort of how development affected our decisions, oftentimes unconsciously. Also, this idea, the difference between what you think you need versus what you truly need. Mm. And a lot of people get confused about that. So that's one of the other things. And then you have to understand, how do I embed something into my unconscious or subconscious? And you do that through a process called value tagging. And what I mean by that is you have to demonstrate to the brain that something is important to you. Now, that can be done out of fear or anxiety or a deep question that you fixate on, or defining an intention you want to manifest. And the reason I use the example of something as an example, fear, as a neurosurgeon, I see patients who have different conditions. And I may tell somebody as an example, well, you know, you have this tumor in your brain. It's benign. It's called a meningioma. And they'll say, I've never heard of that. Yet you see them a month or two later and they go, it's the most amazing thing. I've seen 5 people who I met who have the exact same condition. Or it's like seeing, I saw an orange Mustang the other day and I'm going, God, I've never seen that color. And then within a few days, I saw 4 or 5 of them. And that's because you put that into your subconscious, it got embedded, and now you're attuned.
You tagged it.
You tagged it, yeah. And so your subconscious is always looking for situations like that where you would have normally ignored it before. So if you have an intention that you wish to manifest, you have to make it salient to your brain. So the first part is, and a lot of people don't appreciate, we have 10 million bits of information through our sensory organs that are coming through all the time. Now, 99.9% are related to maintaining homeostasis or bodily functions, but there's about 50 to 100 that we can have access to on a conscious level. And when you embed an intention consciously through the acts we talked about, thinking about it, writing it down, reading it, etc., then it makes it salient. So what happens is this part of our brain, this network, is called the default mode network. It is self-referential. It's associated typically with mind wandering or daydreaming, but it's all about the representation of who we are or how we see ourselves or how we wish to be. Once that gets embedded there and activates that, then it next activates, and that's called a task negative network, actually. But then it activates the task positive network, which is the salience network. We've now made it salient. It's as if we took that intention, put it in a file, and embedded it in a filing cabinet in our salience network and said, this is important to me.
Yeah.
Then once that happens, then this activates our attention network. Now we're going to, because it's important, we're going to attend to it with our consciousness in the sense. And as a result, then you start looking around for any instance. In the book, I use the example of the bloodhound, that once it smells what's in that file, it has to find it. So it's looking everywhere. And this is the nature of coincidence or synchronicity. You go, that's amazing. I was just thinking about this. Now it's here. And this is how it works. And once it's been tagged as important and your subconscious has looked around for it, then your consciousness through the executive control network, which, if you will, makes things happen, you track it down. And as an example, I was at a coffee shop several weeks ago, and there's a project I've been working on, but it was very noisy, and you can't hear anything. Yet, in the din of all of that, I heard somebody talking about the exact same thing I was working on. And it resulted in me in getting up and introducing myself. But it's like you being at a party. I mean, parties oftentimes are really noisy. Yet, if somebody says your name in the din of all of this, because your identity is so deeply embedded in you, you turn to it, right? And it's the same type of thing. You have activated these brain networks which work together to help you manifest your intention.
Yeah, those moments happen for us all throughout our lives. And I think, again, we forget that that happens, and what do you think about the idea of having, we'll say, a magic notebook where you write down when those moments occur and you write them down so you remember how powerful you are and kind of co-creating these, what we would deem to be magical moments? What do you think about that?
No, I think that's a good idea because, again, it strengthens your belief system, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important. It's changing your mindset. And really, that's what we're changing. We're changing your mindset that many people have, which is a negative one, which is, it's not possible for me, to one of, oh, it is potentially possible. It can happen, or it has happened. And once you see it happen a few times, you go, yeah, I can do it. And in some ways, this also brings up an important point, which is the nature of habit. Habits are important. And you don't go out and say, I'm going to run a marathon and wake up and run a marathon, right? It's like for yourself, as you changed how you saw yourself, and ultimately it wasn't that you became a stud with six packs the next day when you woke up and said, I want that. What had to happen? You had to go to the gym every day, probably, and you had to look at the other guys who were built and you go, shit, I don't look that good. But you persisted every day. And then suddenly over 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, you're like going, wow, I look like these guys now. That's amazing. But it's because you created a habit where you showed up every day, you did the work that's necessary. And this also emphasizes a point that there's no free ride. It's not like, okay, Jim, I read your book. Okay, tomorrow it's all going to happen for me. It doesn't work that way. And the great thing I think about the book is that it gives a 6-week program, or at least 6 lessons you can do that help you change your brain through science to create a plan to how to change your life.
Now, this speaks to a really phenomenal fact that I don't think a lot of us ever think about, which is no two humans have the same brain. Every single person's brain is vastly unique, but we just kind of see it as this like squishy, almost soft as butter organ. But you actually, in your work, you have seen many brains, and you know that brains can be very functionally different, but also this practice of entraining our beliefs changes our brain, our physical brain, and also different activities. So if you could talk about how our thoughts can change our brain, but also how things like playing an instrument can literally make our brain different.
Well, that's absolutely correct. Every brain is different. But that being said, most people have the capacity, which they don't appreciate, to change their brain or how they think or their mindset. And this is extraordinarily powerful. And it gets back to this idea of self-agency. Many people frequently give their self-agency away. As an example, I remember when I was an undergraduate, First of all, I mean, I struggled because I didn't have a background for going to college. It was not a high priority at all in my family. And also, here I had many quote unquote friends, but almost all of them were from affluent backgrounds. And here I was struggling in school. I mean, my grade point average when I applied to med school was 2.53, where the average to get into med school was 3.76. And my quote unquote friends would say, you'll never get into med school. It's a waste of time. Why are you trying? You're never going to make it. And this is actually also something that's horrible, because while each of our brains are unique, they're different, they have different capacities. The reality is, though, that every brain has the ability to change. And if you listen to people tell you what you can't do and you believe it, that becomes truth or reality. And I was fortunate in that Ruth made me understand that nobody had the right to decide my destiny. And I think that's really true. People will listen to friends. Sometimes they'll listen to parents or siblings or others who somehow believe that they have the right to tell you what's possible for you. And nobody has that right.
In this instance, because, judging you off of your GPA, none of these individuals understood where you were coming from and what you were dealing with in your life that was affecting what you were doing with schoolwork. But they also weren't acknowledging your potential as well. And so you faced somewhat of a board who kind of had your fate in their hands with the decision of, can this individual be placed into medical school? And you were able to go up against that opposition. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, and this gets back to the thing is that, and we talked about implicit bias. People make judgments about you of which there's no evidence that those judgments are actually valid judgments. If nobody knows anything about you, and we were talking about getting into medical school. At my college, you had to go to a pre-med committee to get a letter of recommendation before you could even apply to college or medical school. And so I went to the office to get an appointment, and the woman looked up my file and she said, I'm not giving you an appointment. Now, imagine you're 20 years old. This has been your dream. And the woman says to me, I said, why? And she says to me, because it's a waste of everyone's time. Now, how is it possible somebody would make a statement, such a hurtful statement to somebody?
To a kid, a young person.
Yeah.
Especially.
Now, fortunately, for whatever reason, I had the wherewithal to say, well, I appreciate your statement, but I'm not leaving here until you give me an appointment. And she did. And so imagine what it was like, though, to go to this appointment. And of course, I'm very anxious. And I walk into a room, and I'm sure you've seen the photographs. Remember of Putin at one end of a long table, these other people at the other end. In some ways, this was the same. There are these three individuals in their white coats. And at one end of the table, I'm at the other end. And the guy in charge who's sitting in the middle, he stands up, he has my file, he throws it on the table, and he says, say what you have to say so we can get this over with. I mean, how brutal, how horrible, how mean. And fortunately, I looked at him and I said, who gave you the right to destroy people's dreams? I said, you know nothing about me other than a grade point average. And then I went on to, for about 20 minutes, telling him that there's no evidence that beyond an above average level of intelligence is necessary to succeed, and that you have to understand people have different events in their lives that influence their grade point average, and it's not fair. And I refuse to allow you to objectify me to a grade. And the reality is, once you force somebody to look at you as a human being and not as a grade point average, they cannot turn away from that.
Yeah.
And as a result, they, all three of them ended up crying, right? So at the end of this, they actually ended up giving me the highest letter of recommendation. The secretary, as I was leaving, because she was in the back of the room, she said, listen, I want to give you this. And it was a brochure for a summer enrichment program for socioeconomically disadvantaged students and minority students at Tulane University in New Orleans. And she said to me, she said, but I want you to understand the deadline has passed, but I don't think that's going to matter for you. So I ended up calling this lady. She let me into the program. I applied to one medical school, and that was Tulane. And I actually did not have enough credits to even graduate. So they accepted me with a 2.52 or 5.3 GPA and no degree. So, yeah.
It's amazing.
But you have to also now come around and understand the rest of the story here. And it gets also back to no one can judge anyone's ability. So after Hurricane Katrina, which had a huge impact in New Orleans, the medical school was flooded. It shut down for 2 years. The students were sent off to Baylor. The library was severely damaged. And so afterwards, they were trying to find the dean, actually, the medical school resigned. So they were looking for a new dean, and they had a fellow from Harvard, but he wanted an endowed chair. Now, an endowed chair is typically a benefactor gives several $1 million, and it names a chair after them. And then the professor then, because it's endowed, receives the benefit from those funds. So they were looking for someone to endow the dean's chair. So lo and behold, I ended up endowing the dean's chair and repairing the library. So today, the dean remains the Doty professor at the medical school. I repaired the library, and I'm also on the board of governors. So you never know what one person has in terms of the ability to manifest a future.
Yeah.
And this is why never underestimate the power of somebody to change their lives by changing their brain.
Yeah. Oh, man. This is amazing. Amazing. That's one of those full circle moments. And also in those moments when those individuals who you interacted with, that was so impactful for so many students into the future, but it was that moment of you standing for yourself and representing yourself. And also I love that moment when she said, it's probably not going to matter for you. Like it passed, but she just saw what you can do. And having that mindset, come what may, I'm going to figure this thing out. I'm going to do what's necessary. And having a little bit of that sprinkled in to, your mind magic, and having the audacity to do that, though. It's working on yourself and all the things that you learned early on from Ruth, and just putting this formula together. And you're going to have those moments of decision. And wow, this is just blowing me away. There's so many other things I want to talk to you about, but I want to ask you again, what I'm hearing is we're coming into this world. We've got this amazing instrument that we're all endowed with, the human mind, the human brain, and it sets out to start getting data and getting programmed a certain way. And it might get programmed in a way that's not advantageous to the life that you want. And what you're saying is that no matter where you are, no matter who you are, you can change your brain, and that is going to change your life automatically. And doing so, just to anchor this in, we can physically change our brain. Our brain can get a different structure based on our choices. Is that adequate to say?
No, that's absolutely correct. And if you look at, as an example, monks, Buddhist monks, as an example, they can control their body temperature. They can control their heart rate. Or you look at Wim Hof, who's another example. Through deep mental training, he can be out in the cold And theoretically, I guess he was trying to climb to Everest in shorts and no shoes. Now, I would caution that, let's say, an individual like Wim Hof, or even Olympic athletes, that is a combination of genetics combining with intention. As an example, I was probably not going to become a marathon runner, right? Or at least a world-class marathon runner, because I may not have had the combination of genes that allow me to do that. But that being said, I could become a pretty damn good one. And so, yes, there are people who just through nature end up having their activity, whether it's a sport or whatever, combined with the right genetic makeup that makes them better than almost anyone else.
Yeah.
But for most of us, we can maximize what our genes allow us to do, but it may not necessarily be world class.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying this. This is one of my favorite moments of this right now, because this speaks to, again, it's not about being, quote, realistic. It's about blending what your template is, your own genetic makeup, which is already miraculous in and of itself. But for example, if you're coming into the game, you're now, a grown man, you're 25 years old and you're 5'1", and you're just like, I'm going to, be the greatest basketball player of all time. It's probably not going to work out like that. But with your intention and you focused on, the training, or you focusing on, learning, educating yourself around basketball, whatever the case might be, it's going to land you somewhere in the stratosphere of excellence in something to do with basketball, right? So that you might be the greatest sports writer who ever existed for the NBA, or you might end up in some kind of ownership with the NBA, and I've seen this literally happen with some of my friends and even people who've been on the show, like Jesse Itzler, for example. He's now a part owner of the Atlanta Hawks. And this is just one of those things that he had this interest in basketball, just growing up. And it's something that he stayed connected to throughout all his entrepreneurial adventures. But it was this love of this game, and certain things unfolded to where he's now a part owner of this team. You know what I mean?
Well, I would also tell you, my younger son, who's 15, is a big basketball fan. But he reminded me, and there's a fellow who's 5'6" who plays professional basketball, I guess. And so everyone told him, you're never going to make it. So even with many apparent disadvantages, you can potentially reach a level of excellence. But again, it takes work, it takes practice, it takes habit formation, and it takes an iron will to make that happen. But I would also caution that when you have an intention or a goal, if you get so engaged in it to the point where you believe you have to accomplish that and you sacrifice everything, you have to then think, okay, now I'm at the top of the mountain, but what have I sacrificed?
Yeah, what is this for?
Because, there's some people who get into their head that they have to do X, Y, or Z. But along the way, they sacrifice friends, they sacrifice marriages, they sacrifice their children. And for what? And I think that's an important issue people have to confront, because we get confused sometimes about what's really important.
Yeah.
And people, again, giving you external affirmation, telling you how great you are, doesn't take care of immense loneliness you have from discarding every person in your life to get there. And one of the greatest causes of suffering for many people is attachment and craving. And when you're so attached to an outcome, it actually can be very self-destructive.
Yeah. Yeah. This goes back to that ancient tenet to know thyself. And I don't think a lot of people's problem is thinking too big. It's not thinking big enough. It's not really knowing what potential they really have and stretching oneself. And so I want to give it that little caveat of being mindful to, take into consideration what is possible. Yes. But also understand you have so much more potential in you than you probably realize. And with that being said, The potential of this conversation has run its course, and there's so many more things I want to talk to you about. So hopefully we could do this again. Can you let people know where to pick up a copy of Mind Magic?
Sure. First of all, though, just to respond to a comment you made, use the term audacious. And I think that's the way people should look at the world. What is your audacious aspiration of who you want to be?
Yeah.
And if you combine that with being of service, because as I said earlier, it's not a negation of materialism. I enjoy having things, but your focus needs to be on how can I be of service? And that gets you all the other stuff when, or if you decide you actually need the other stuff. And I think that's really, really important.
One of the greatest moments in this conversation for me personally that really stood out was when you apparently sacrificed that opportunity to have some money when you didn't have anything, when everything was seemingly taken from you. And you had the ventures with the stocks and all this stuff, which ended up being approximately $30 million in value. And what that effectively was, it was a form of tithing. You know, you were giving something away that you didn't necessarily even think that you had. And, you know, it's one of those seemingly commands. You talked about how the universe doesn't really give a shit, but this command to the universe or this this signal you're sending out that I'm okay, I have enough, I'm going to be okay. And as a matter of fact, I want to do good. And so seeing these things in a strange way coming back to you, this has been a tenet in so many different spiritual frameworks of tithing, of giving, even when you don't think you have a lot to give, just that spirit of giving and starting to embed that in your subconscious, right? So when you're doing that, you're embedding this like rhythm and this framework and this belief in I have the ability to give. And so even as I'm aspiring to be great and to accomplish these cool things in my life, this is going to be about service to others as well. This isn't just about me, it's about we.
No, that's exactly right. And I think the other point is that single action liberated me. And what I mean by that is if you grow up poor, what do you think is the most important thing?
Yeah.
Having money. And by doing that action, it freed me. That was no longer the narrative anymore. And that also then allowed me, again, to look at the world not from the I perspective, but from the we perspective. And again, if you look at the world through that lens, you get everything you need.
Everybody needs a copy of Mind Magic. Can you let everybody know where to pick up a copy?
Yes. One of the places you can pick up a copy online is at bookshop.org. And the reason I mention that is a group of independent booksellers which supports them. But of course, you can also get it at Amazon as well as at Barnes & Noble and frankly, almost any bookstore.
Awesome. This has been phenomenal. I was really looking forward to this conversation, and you really helped me to just re-energize this awareness. And I think one of the things that I took away from just studying your work was, you know, once you accomplished all these things, you might get away from the practice and remembering what got you there. And so it really helped to re-energize my practice, and I needed that right now. So I really appreciate you.
Well, thank you. And you know, I think one of the toughest things is humility. And when you accomplish a lot, there's always the danger of you taking yourself too seriously or thinking you're important. And none of us are that important. What's important, like I said, be of service.
Awesome. Dr. James Doty, everybody.
Okay, my friend.
Thank you. Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
That awakening process typically happens when people reach their lowest denominator. They hit rock bottom because then they can see themselves through the eyes of somebody else. You feel so altered, you're not returning any text. That's when you start observing yourself. I mean, you can learn and change in pain and suffering, or you can learn and change in joy and inspiration.